is a way scientists often describe what is colloquially known as camouflage. So to start off at the beginning. So you're sitting out there bird watching, looking at something like a really bright common yellowthroat. So what you're actually doing is looking at light reflected or coming from the sun, reflected off a bird, and then reflected to your eye. And different wavelengths are absorbed by the bird and others are reflected back to you. And that's how you perceive color. And color is truly produced. And scientists study this by measuring wavelengths of light, because the way humans perceive light isn't the same way as birds do. So it's really important to use quantifiable methods and actually measure the properties of the light itself, because otherwise it's really hard to measure in a meaningful way for a bird. So a lot of times you'll see light broken down into the visible spectrum and then based on its wavelength, but even that term is in a very human-centric way. So what's visible to birds is actually, so this is what's human visible, and then birds can actually see into the UV, or a lot of birds can, and other animals can even see farther than birds can. So it's really important to think about color not just as the colors we see, but as the different wavelengths that are being reflected back to potential receivers of that light. And we'll be talking about that more, so hopefully it'll make more sense later. But the basics of it, of like how do you actually think about these properties of light in a way that makes sense in the terms of color, is if you're aware of hue, maybe in design or color or artistic pursuits, hue is the dominant or peak wavelength. So what we think of as blue is something that reflects primarily in these wavelengths, like 400s usually, versus yellow is reflecting higher wavelengths, and then red even higher. So where this peak is corresponds to where most of the light is being reflected, and that is how we perceive it as using our visual system. But this is also a way to measure coloration in a way that's objective unrelated to our visual system. So it's kind of important to think about this both in terms of what we see in our eyes, but also what the properties of that light are, because animals perceive it differently. So the way scientists do that is using reflectance spectra. So this is one of them, where you have reflectance on the y-axis and wavelength on the x-axis. So the way you measure that is with a spectrophotometer, which emits a little bit of light, and it measures how much of that is reflected at different wavelengths. So it's an objective way to measure what wavelengths are being reflected, unrelated to our eyes. And it took scientists a bit to figure this out. And when a lot of the first research on bird and other coloration was done, a lot of times scientists would describe this in terms of our vision, so describing it specifically by hue. So a lot of the 1800s literature is filled with hue and kind of this artistic language, and it does correspond to something meaningful, but scientists learned how to be more objective, and especially once a lot of ornithologists realized that birds could see UV, which was kind of a game changer. And you can think another thing that kind of translates is chroma, which you can think about as saturation. So imagine dragging that slider on photographs from more or less saturation on your photographs potentially. And the way to think about that is the more wavelength, the fewer wavelengths that are being reflected back across the entire spectrum, the more that is being reflected back at one you look in this graph, the most green, most intense, most saturated part of it is a reflectance curve that looks like this, where there are very few other wavelengths being reflected. Versus imagine if you took that same paint that you might have had that reflects this light and then add some gray to it. So it means that if you measured another reflectance spectra of that less saturated grayed down color, you reflect at many different wavelengths and you get a lower chroma. And then brightness is kind of lightness. So it's how much light is being reflected back. So you can imagine something like this brown is a pretty dark color, so less wavelengths or less of that light being emitted by a spectrophotometer is being reflected back. So it's a lower curve versus the pink is a lighter color, more is being reflected. So that's why it's considered a brighter color. And then just to throw it out there, because it's just fun to think about, we think of purple and violet often the same, and scientifically they're not. So when we think about true violet, it's not a combination of red and blue wavelengths, it's actually its own color. Versus if it's a true purple, it is a true combination of how our eyes perceive and our brains perceive combinations of red and blue wavelengths. So hopefully that didn't scare people off too much. We'll be talking about what that actually means, which I think helps actually kind of ground all of that talk of wavelengths. So we kind of have some idea of how scientists would measure coloration, but how is it actually produced? So talking about different wavelengths being reflected back. But fundamentally, to produce color, some wavelengths must be absorbed and others reflected. That's the basics of it. And in order to do that, what birds and a lot of other animals generally do is you have some kind of either structure or pigment in its skin or feathers that scatters some wavelengths and then allows other wavelengths to penetrate into it and are absorbed by usually another layer below it. So if you saw something that was absorbing red wavelengths but reflecting blue and green, what do you think it would be perceived as by us in the world? So type it into the chat if you have some ideas of what this would be perceived as, what color it would be perceived as. Yeah, exactly. Blue, green, aqua, that kind of color, somewhere in that range. Exactly. This is a lot easier when giving this talk in front of people in person. So there are multiple ways to produce color. Birds do this in a variety of different ways. So there are pigments. So these are things like chemical compounds that selectively absorb wavelengths and scatter the rest. So these are things like, you can kind of think of them as a lot of the common colors we see in birds and also in humans. So this is what pigments give our hair and skin color the color it is for the most part, excluding like lips are colored by actually our blood, but skin color, hair color are produced by pigments, and a lot of bird coloration is produced by those pigments. And then structural color is kind of a completely different group of it's a kind of a big group of ways to reflect light. So there are actual structures inside a feather that selectively reflect wavelengths. So this is fundamental to the structure, and this is a really active area of research. So we're still learning about which birds are doing this and the molecular structure that does this. So this is a pretty fascinating area. But just to give you some examples of which, I'll be talking about this more, but things like hummingbirds, the iridescence is produced actually by structural color. So as they move, the structures reflect light differently, and that's one of the ways they're producing structural color, or structural color is producing the color that they're showing. And then things like this oriole and goldfinch, pretty much all of their color is produced by pigments. So The most common pigment in the animal kingdom is melanin. So that's true of birds, but also mammals and a lot of other things. Because even other colors are often combined with melanin to produce a more intense color to absorb those other wavelengths that aren't being reflected by other mechanisms. So these are things like blacks and grays and browns and some yellows and oranges. So some of the colors can be somewhat hard to tell visually, but things like the browns in this barn owl, the red color, like this brownish red colors, are all melanins. Then of course the blacks and grays too. These are large proteins, so the important thing for evolutionary purposes is that they're really easy to produce. So you don't have to, a bird, all of these organisms that use melanin don't have to eat anything special to have melanin or produce melanin. Instead, they're synthesized from amino acids, which makes them essentially very cheap to produce. And we'll be talking about other mechanisms that are not so cheap. And this has really important consequences for birds, how they actually use those pigments. So this is not diet limited. They're really not limited in any significant way. So this is really important for how birds use them. But this is also why one of the reasons why you see them all over the place is because they're really cheap and they evolved long ago in evolutionary history. And there are two different types, one that's called eumelanin and one that's called pheomelanin. So pheomelanin, some examples are shown here. It's kind of this red or like yellowish red color, red-brown color. So all of these are examples of pheomelanin, everything from red hair to cinnamon teal to red foxes, red knots. All these are just examples of pheomelanin or pheomelanin combined with eumelanin. But the more red it is, that reddish brown color is kind of the hallmark of eumelanin versus, or sorry, of pheomelanin. Looking at the next slide while talking about the last one, not a good strategy. So eumelanin are kind of the pure grays. So these are things like black caps or gray backs of Caspian terns, this really pure color that doesn't look like it's washed out in browns. Those are eumelanin. So these are some examples. But most color is actually a mix of both. So kind of all of these different examples are, or at least the browns on the mallard, are an example of a combination of eum and pheomelanin. So that's kind of the name of the game to produce the variety of colors that we see in nature is animals are really good at, or through evolutionary time, they evolve combinations that produce a wide variety of colors, even within the brown and gray spectrums. So the next kind of big category are carotenoids. These are diet derived, so that becomes important when we talk about how these are used. And these are a lot of different colors of red to yellow. So red, yellow, orange are all common colors produced by carotenoids. Parrots can produce them their own way, but most birds produce it that we see, at least in North America, are producing it using carotenoids. But there are a lot of other kind of weird, less common pigments. So biliverdin gives robin eggs their blue color. It's one of the few blues that are actually produced by a pigment, not by structural color. Pterins give that bright yellow of birds' eyes and some other animals as well. Sticklefolvins are just essentially parrot pigments. So they produce the yellows, reds, and oranges in parrots. And one of these more fun different coloration methods is porphyrins, which are actually photosensitive pigments. So in one of the ways that banders age how old saw-whet owls are, they actually use UV light to see if some of their wing feathers fluoresce under the UV, or under the blue light. And what they find is if they're first year or second year birds, they do still have those porphyrins in their feathers. And then flavins give yolks their color. So these are some of the more well-known pigments, but there are even ones that are rarer than that that the scientists are still describing. So things like there's some evidence that some of the eiders that have green are using a different kind of pigment that scientists are still exploring now. What's the structure of that and how it relates to other pigments. So there's still a lot that we don't know, and that's the interesting thing about this field. So structural colors is kind of the next big category. So you have pigments, and then you have structural colors, and these are microstructures within the feather itself that reflect specific wavelengths. So these can produce any color at all. Birds tend to produce blues and purples and greens using structural color, but just when people think that there are general rules for birds, one will come out there and have different structural color that is typically thought of as maybe carotenoid based or melanin based. So these can actually, structural color can produce any color. So it's still, there's still a lot of understanding left to do in, among scientists of why birds have one or the other, or which ones have which. Because for most birds, we actually haven't tested what is causing the color. So I'm not going to get into them. We've gone far enough down the rabbit hole with physics, but this is an umbrella term of a lot of different structural patterns that are a part of the feather itself that reflect light. And this is also a very active area of research too. And like I mentioned, they can produce any color. And here are just a few. So common birds like our blue jay, all those blues, those are structural colors. A lot of greens, really intense colors like in peafowl, down to kind of more drab blues like in kingfishers. So a wide variety of colors can be produced with structural color, and it kind of rounds out what the variety of color that we see in birds. So hopefully you guys will type in the chat, because this is not, I'm trying to encourage participation even on a more boring webinar format. Let's see. Put in the chat which colors you think, which birds have structural coloration. So remember, structural color can produce any color, but it often is associated with blues and iridescence. What ones might be using structural color? Yes, thank you, Kathleen. So yes, the peacock on the last slide, and on this one, grackle. Yes, these are all great examples. And on this slide as well, the indigo bunting and black-throated blue warblers are also examples. So backyard birds included in this slide, or just any you want to shout out, what might be using carotenoid-based coloration, using some carotenoid-based pigments to give them their colors. So this is your reds and your yellows and your oranges. Yes, cardinals. Actually, parrots use psittacofulvin, so very close, but not quite, because parrots are special. Okay, you guys seem to, or at least folks who are responding seem to have the idea of what kind of the differences are. So very cool. So now we're gonna switch gears from how birds are producing the color to how it's being perceived by receivers. So a lot of times in science and in communication literature, it talks that these are talked about as senders or signalers. So the bird with the signal that is being reflected, and receivers or eavesdroppers, depending on if that is the intended receiver or not. So birders are eavesdroppers, females that this male might be singing to and displaying his beautiful yellow patch. The females of that male of common yellow throats would be receivers, intentional receivers. So we're back to reflecting light, and now we're going to focus on the receiver and how that actually gets perceived. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of how this works, but the basic concept is you get light being reflected from the signal, in this case some bright red feathers of this blocky bird here, is being reflected to an eye. And light energy is captured by the visual pigment rhodopsin and stimulates specialized cells in your eye. So your eye, bird's eye, turtle's eyes, insect eyes, everybody uses rhodopsin. This is an example of our shared evolutionary history. So every organism that uses vision, even really basic vision, uses rhodopsin. And then specialized cells transmit nerve impulses to the brain where it's processed further. So it's not just whatever reflects on the back of your eye automatically gets interpreted. Your brain is really complex, has really complex mechanisms to process the information it's getting from your eye. And to get color vision, not just to get the color vision that most birds have and the color vision that we have, you have to have at least 2 types of photoreceptor, or sorry, actually, there are 2 types. I'm going to start over. I thought, sorry. Color vision, you can have, okay, sorry. There are 2 types of photoreceptors, cones and rods. So cones allow our organisms to perceive color, and rods are generally used for low light conditions. And for color vision, in order to have color vision, you have to have multiple receptor pigments that absorb different wavelengths. Otherwise, your brain doesn't have any information about different wavelengths being absorbed. And it needs that to figure out differences in color. And depending on how many of those pigments you have, or an organism has, you get different levels of color vision acuity. And the other thing that we'll be talking about a little bit more is there's only so much room for cones and rods in a given eye. So often animals specialize more in color vision or low light vision, and have more of one or the other, so that they can maximize what is most adaptive to them. So color vision is has a wide variety of types, and it can be divided in a lot of different ways. But one of them is by how many different pigments the organism has in its eye. So if you just have one visual pigment, they're monochromats. Dichromats have 2. If you have 3, like humans, you're a trichromat. So most of us probably are trichromats. There might be, if you're colorblind, you're a dichromat. And then tetrachromats are what a lot of birds are. And this I'm going to stop talking at tetra, but just know in the animal world, there's lots of other crazy things that have a lot of pigments. And this, they're even just discovering more, researchers are right now. So monochromats either have all rod retinas or rods plus cones with 1 pigment. So a lot of these are nocturnal animals because of that trade-off between having a lot of rods for that good low light vision, which is really important if you're nocturnal, versus a lot of our diurnal species have more cones or different types of pigments in their cones. So these are just some examples. A lot of our nocturnal animals are here as well. So they can see shades of gray and brightness better than people, organisms with color vision, because they actually have more of those rods in their eyes, so they can tell that acuity better. And that's unrelated to how large their eyes are. But a lot of them, as you can see here, have both large eyes and a lot of those rods for low light vision. So moving on to dichromats, this is a lot of mammals, not all, but a lot of them are in this category. It's a restricted range of colors. It's still continuous, but it's hard to exactly think about them in terms of human vision, because they see the same wavelengths as we do, but they can't distinguish between reds, oranges, and yellows. So things we perceive as reds, oranges, and yellows are perceived as the same thing to a lot of mammals, like squirrels and dogs and cats and New World monkeys are all in this category. And we'll talk a little bit more what that might look like in a second. And here are just some examples. And then trichromats have 3 cone pigments. So these are things like people, like Carl. If you're familiar with Carl Schwartz, a lot of coral reef fish, many lizards are in this category, and that allows us to see a wider range of colors and potentially signal in different ways than dichromats or monochromats. And a lot of our old world monkeys have re-evolved trichromacy. So like I was saying, most mammals are dichromats, but old world monkey primates like us re-evolved a 3rd visual pigment. And to try to give some idea of what the difference between a dichromat and a trichromat is, think about a dog's view versus ours. It's not exactly this, but this is the best way I found to visualize it. So instead of being able to distinguish between red and orange and yellow, you see, or dogs see, that it's kind of this blob of color that's is not able to be differentiated versus humans. But the same thing is true of birds versus us, except because there's no way to see what the difference between, there's no way for us to perceive that. You just have to kind of imagine that in your head, which kind of breaks my mind, is how to imagine the world as a bird or a tetrachromat bird does. I don't know how to do it, but it's fun to think about. So a lot of our birds are tetrachromats, some lizards, turtles, some shallow water fish, and butterflies. So a lot of these guys depend on fine scale acuity to perceive color. So things like butterflies often look at pretty subtle differences between fully mature flowers and immature flowers, and a lot of the fish in shallow water have signal or look at other species that use a wide variety of colors. So all of these are in situations where having that better acuity and better differentiation of color is important. Many of these can see UV, but not all. Some of them see essentially the same wavelengths that we do, but they have higher resolution of being able to perceive different colors. So this is one example of that, of being able to see UV. So this is a little bit of a complicated graph, but what you see here is kind of the dotted lines are kind of your standard visual pigments of a standard passerine. So standard little perching bird. A lot of them, or most of them, have a UV sensitive pigment, then short wave, mid wave, long wave pigments. But birds are really awesome. They can, a lot of them have evolved oil droplets that basically shift the sensitivity so that they can have different visual peak sensitivity ranges for each of those. So by being able to shift slightly, they're able to get more resolution, which is pretty cool, I think. Even though there's no real good way to show what UV looks like, scientists first started out by just looking at, with UV photography, what was reflecting for birds. And they found that a lot of them have patches that we can't really see at all. So if you look at these birds here, you can see patches here, here that reflect in UV that we can't really perceive at all. And this is true of a lot of mammalian predators, since birds are more common to be tetrachromats, while a lot of predators are di or monochromats. It means that birds can have an advantage by having gaudy signals that can't be seen by their predators. So that's why a lot of our birds use UV signals that can't be seen otherwise. So that was a lot about how birds produce and perceive color. And now we'll be switching gears from how to why. So why are these birds doing this at all? Why have they evolved all of this variety that we see today? And it comes down to signaling. A lot of the brighter colors and even some of the not so bright colors are signals, either to conspecifics or sometimes to other organisms as well, or other species as well in a few cases. So usually sexual selection, it gets a lot of our gaudier colors, really bright colors in birds, aggression, identity, and then kind of the anti-signal of crypsis. So birds are often really cryptically colored so that they're not seen by predators. So signals at their most basic level are stimuli produced by a sender and monitored by a receiver to the average benefit of both parties. If it's not to the benefit of both parties, it's really hard to evolve. So things like, say, a bird's really brightly colored and that's being perceived by a predator. That would not be a signal. That would just be a predator eavesdropping on a bird. That's not something that the bird is evolved to communicate to the predator. And sometimes I will use colloquial language like intends to, and I don't mean it to sound like birds are actively thinking this way, just through evolutionary time, they evolve to have signals with the outcome of signaling to another individual. So even if I say this bird is signaling to another bird, I mean, it's not always a conscious thought of the bird, it's through evolutionary time. These signals have evolved and are for benefit of both receiver and sender. So a lot of our sexual selected traits obviously are signals between the male and the female. That's more common, but there are a few species where the females do really cool dances and have gaudy colors and display to the males. There are individual species, a lot of species show age differences in plumage where they're signaling their age so that they have less aggression towards them. And some really cool species have just a ton of varieties like these ruffs so that they can actually be individually identified, which is very cool. But those are all examples of signals. Visual signals can be characterized by 5 properties. The color, so those wavelengths that I was talking about earlier, what wavelengths are being present and reflected back potentially to a receiver. Brightness, how intense that color is. The spatial characteristics, so how is it patterned? So think about different warblers with different color patterns. And temporal variability. This is, the actual color change isn't really in the cards for most birds, but in, say, lizards or fish, they can actually change the color of their bodies in temporal, like at temporal scales that are important for animals. But birds do movement a lot. So a lot of times birds do dances or things like that that show off their colors to best advantage. And then they can also be contrast. The last property is contrast with the background. So this is conspicuousness. So a lot of males actually display purposefully on areas that have highest contrast. So here's a few, I'm going to walk through each of these different methods or ways of describing signals and look at how, if they minimize or maximize that characteristic, you might either blend in or really contrast. So things like counter shading. So a lot of, especially aquatic animals have this, but also a lot of our birds. So think of a lot of our sparrows, or a lot of smaller birds are darker on top, lighter on the underside. And if this is more cryptic coloration, so that if, say, a bird is being perceived by a predator above, they blend in when looking from above, versus if they're above a predator, they're lighter, and that is blending in with a lighter background if they're perceived from above. But birds and other animals also kind of flip this script to have higher contrast and be more noticeable in the landscape. Species like bobolinks, the males are darker on the underside and lighter on the top, and this actually makes them more visible in their habitats. And that's when is one of the hints that is being used as a signal if you're not blending in. And then eye spots, those don't blend in, but they try, a lot of animals use them to scare off predators. And background matching is kind of another big category where organisms blend in both through pattern and color to their background. So you can see here with a brown creeper and above with a meadowlark. So hopefully this video will work. If not, I will send you a link to it. Just in case you're sick of hearing me talk, hopefully this will give you a really cool example of movement. Please type in if it is not working.
First thing you do is you're sitting on your perch and click, you fly away. Once you're out there, you come swooping in, do a loop-de-loo in the air. Land on the perch, and at the end of that, what the males do is they lean over, lift up their tail, quiver the tail slightly, and nail their feathers against their sides. And now you're going to do a moonwalk, and this is the only known case of birds moonwalking to my knowledge. But they basically do these little steps backwards, and it looks like a Michael Jackson slide. It's very nice.
Okay, so hopefully that was a fun break of seeing, while also seeing how movement can be used to kind of set off the coloration that birds have. So that's a red-capped manakin, which is a really cool study system that people have used to understand sexual selection. And the other thing that I find really funny is that the person who is dancing there is now a professor who is pretty famous. So I find that extra special. So you can either maximize or minimize contrast. So you can be like a mannequin, maximizing contrast by making sure you're displaying in the best little arena possible. And a lot of times they actually both choose their arenas well, but also kind of modify them to maximize their contrast. And then you can minimize, birds minimize contrast in a lot of different ways, but ptarmigans are one of my favorites because they both molt to match their background, but also males keep their white plumage longer than their snow to display to females. But as soon as they're done mating, they start adding on their own camouflage by rolling in the dirt and trying to get as much crypsis as they can from having dirt added to their plumage until they molt into brown plumage. But all of this has limitations by the environment. So it's not that any animal could just go evolve any coloration and have it be adaptive. Instead, it's limited by the environment. So this comes in the form of a lot of different things. So available light. So the environment itself can have different waves of light available to reflect off plumage. So imagine in a really dense forest, you might not have the same wavelengths available as in a really open desert. So birds actually evolve to match the wavelengths available. And then perception ability is important both for the receivers of the signal, but also eavesdroppers. So this is one reason why a lot of birds use UV, is because they can signal in wavelengths that can't be perceived by most of their predators. So, but it means that potentially there are downsides to being so contrasting with the environment, especially in ways that are perceivable by your predators, like this warbler here. And a really cool study that looked at this was with Philoscopus warblers. And they looked at, in habitats that are darker versus brighter, how many light colored patches did they have? And what they found in this really cool study is that they had more light patches in darker environments than in lighter environments down here. And this is kind of what you would expect. If there isn't a lot of light available, you need more patches to show off to in this case, males showing off to females, and you need more available if you're still going to pass the same amount of information to females. So honesty is a big guiding principle to a lot of signals in the animal kingdom. The more conflict of interest there are, the more enforcement that's necessary. So if there's a lot of conflict of interest, there's a lot of incentive to evolve dishonest signals. But if they're linked to condition or have some other kind of enforcement mechanism, they have to be honest. And those are the ones that tend to persist through evolutionary time. But if there's no conflict, if both the sender and receiver benefit close to equally, no cost is needed. And they can often use quote unquote cheap mechanisms like melanin. So remember that melanin, you can synthesize that from diets through using amino acids, versus some of the other mechanisms to produce pigments or structural colors are often more costly to evolve. And a lot of this work was first figured out in house finches. So you can see some examples here. And I'll talk about that in a second. So as you might imagine, sexual selection, it has some major conflict of interest. So imagine a male wanting to mate with a bunch of females. It's in his evolutionary best interest to mate with as many as possible, versus by potentially signaling that he is in the best condition of all of the males, versus the female only wants to mate with the male that's actually in the best condition. So there's a really big difference in their interest. And when that happens, there needs to be some kind of mechanism. And this is typically a sign that this is the case is a lot of sexual dimorphism. So when you see females that are drabber and the males that are brighter, that's usually a sign that some sexual selection is going on, and vice versa. So things like Hassanas can be the opposite. They have to be costly or inextricably linked to the characteristic that they're signaling. And that makes sense once you see a couple of examples. But what they're actually signaling can be almost anything that is correlated with success of the young. So anything that gives the young an advantage can be what is signaled through sexual selection. So things like condition, foraging ability, if there's a genetic component to that especially, or even if they're co-parenting young, foraging ability, even if it's not genetic, can be beneficial. So they're actually signaling just their ability to be able to produce young or food for young. It can be immunity, attractiveness for future offspring. So just attractiveness for attractiveness sake can be one of the signals that they're using. And basically anything else that is quote unquote good for the kids. So this is why a lot of the characteristics that we see in birds are really variable, and also why it's sometimes hard for scientists to figure out exactly what they're signaling, because it can be a lot of different things. So as I mentioned, this was figured out, or how carotenoids fit into the picture was figured out by Jeff Hill in his lab. They were looking at which males were more attractive to females in house finches, and they found that for carotenoids that are acquired through the diet, the females were more attracted to red males. And this led them down, this was one of the first studies to really show that that carotenoids could be used this way. It had been hypothesized before that, but this was one of the first studies to show how that was linked. And since then, a lot of research has been done on it, showing that they can reflect health, foraging skills, immune quality, because carotenoids aren't just pigments, they are also antioxidants, and a bird can't get them unless they're really good at foraging for plants and insects that already have carotenoids in them. So it's kind of a signal both that they can go out in the world and forage enough to get these awesome carotenoids from their diet. But the other thing is that they're also saying, I have so many carotenoids in my diet that I can just put them in my feathers. I don't need to use them to boost my immunity or use them for anything else. So that's kind of the fundamental trade-off with carotenoids, and that's why it can't be faked. And female house finches reflect that, and also goldfinches do as well. So carotenoids aren't the only ones, but how it exactly works in structural colors is a little less well understood. It seems that structural color isn't as saturated if the males are in poor condition generally, and in some species it's been shown that females are actually selecting for this. So in mountain bluebird shown here, females prefer more blue and more intense blue in males, and that seems to be related to condition. But how that's actually done, I have not seen a good study on establishing how the mechanism actually works. So this has gone poorly every time I've asked this, but can somebody type in which one do you think is the sexiest male to a female house finch? Which corner? Yes, upper right, thank you. Or I would have just sat here awkwardly for longer. Thank you guys. But choosing isn't just for females. So a lot of species that both the male and the female care for the young, instead of in some species it's just the female or just the male. If they both are co-parenting at similar levels, scientists have found a lot of systems where they actually mutually choose. So things like barn owls actually are signaling to each other, and they're both trying to maximize their mating success by choosing the best mate they can find. And then aggression is another thing that some species signal, so, or dominance. So melanin is not very costly to produce, so you might not think that this would be a good choice for aggression or maintaining territoriality, because there's a big conflict of interest there where there's a lot of incentive potentially to lie and say you're more dominant, or have signals where that implies that you're more dominant than you actually are. So in house sparrows, what they found is the badge that's on the chest, like in the kind of chin to chest area of house sparrows, is strongly correlated with dominance. And this was a big mystery for a while, was like, why is this happening? Because this is a really cheap way of producing color, and how would that be maintained if there's a big conflict of interest? And what they found was it's figured out, or they maintain this behaviorally. So what males do is, if they find another male that has a similar level of similar size badge as them, they basically fight. So if they were say lying, they would get their butts kicked by other ones that are not lying. So it would mean that it's a way to enforce honesty. And the way scientists figured this out is they actually took Sharpies and drew on these poor house sparrows and gave some of them bigger badges, and looked what happened to them. And they got in a lot more fights and were in worse condition. So they were able to see, if you manipulated it, what would happen. So I find that always interesting when you can actually experiment on what happens with animal behavior, which is really hard. The other thing that is sometimes signaled is identity. And a lot of times this is done with melanin. And it's because identity is often in everyone's best interest to be honest about. There's very low to no conflict of interest. So say in these roughs, they can individually identify males that are territory holders. So they're able to, since there's so much variation, they look at these different patterns and are able to recognize. So they know what their neighbors are. So they know that Bill, Bob are each of the hold territories right next to them. And it's in everyone's best interest to not fight. So the territory holder doesn't want to fight with Bill or Bob. So as long as they can individually recognize each other, it will reduce the amount of fighting. Versus say a peregrine falcon gets Bob and a new rough shows up for that to hold that territory, they'll fight again. So there's no incentive to lie about your identity, and it reduces territorial aggression and reduces cost of fighting. And the other way this is used is to identify chicks. So in terns, some of the species that are in big colonies have a lot of variation in their plumage as juveniles and chicks. And that's thought to be to help the parents identify their chick and make sure that they're feeding the right chick. And again, no conflict of interest. This can be done with melanin, because both the chick wants to be fed and the adult wants to feed the right chick. So very low conflicts of interest. And then Crypsis, this is kind of anti-signaling. So trying to minimize all of those contrasts that we were talking about earlier. So here are just some different examples, and you can see that in a lot of different ways, from whippoorwills to tern chicks to patterns. And just a quick way of thinking about this, for Crypsis, even in otherwise gaudy males, is eclipse plumage. So a lot of our ducks, the males molt after the breeding season is over and look pretty much like females. So trying to minimize contrast again. And this one that you see on the right is actually a male. You can tell by its yellow bill, but it looks really similar to a female. So it's minimizing its contrast and trying to minimize predation while they're susceptible, while they're molting out, especially when they're molting out their flight feathers. And just one, this isn't really unified by the rest of what I've been talking about, but I think it's too cool not to talk about a little tiny bit, is we actually have learned a little bit about fossil coloration through looking at the structure of feathers in melanophores. So the structures that produce melanin actually get fossilized. So using really well-preserved fossils, scientists have been able to come up with what the colors are of some of these feathered dinosaurs. So I just think that's so cool. And with that, I'm just going to wrap up with what we covered and leave you with one geographic pattern of variation that I studied, and this is Gloger's rule, the pattern of birds being darker in areas of higher humidity, shown here from the Mojave Desert to coastal rainforests of Alaska. So that's what I studied, which got me down this giant rabbit hole of bird coloration, which I find really fascinating, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. And feel free to unmute yourself to do it or type in the chat.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Renata Witt. I have a question about the difference between birds breeding colors and non-breeding colors. Is that only one of the types of coloration that you talked about, or can that be different depending on the color of the bird when they go between breeding colors and non-breeding colors?
So often, a lot of the brighter colors are either structural or carotenoid based. But if you think of like the variety of warblers, so imagine your common yellowthroat. It has a black mask that is melanin based, but it also has that bright yellow bib that is carotenoid based. So it really just depends on what colors they are. And what's fun about those guys is actually both the black mask and the bib are under sexual selection. So females are actually looking at both. So it really just depends on your bird. But in the non-breeding season, a lot of birds are use melanin-based colors because they tend to be more cryptic to predators, and there's, without a breeding season to incentivize looking really beautiful for mates, there's not, you generally just want to be cryptic and avoid predators. So let's see. Is climate change affecting or expecting to affect coloration? Yes. So it is already affecting coloration. That was something that we found in my dissertation. Actually, we found that birds are changing color with climate change. And it's expected to keep doing it. So both landscape change and climate change are expected to change how birds are colored, because you can imagine ways like if the same species that they have eaten historically isn't available anymore, like the ranges don't overlap between the plants that they get some of their carotenoids from, or insects where they get carotenoids from aren't there, then there's a mismatch and they might not be as bright because that source of carotenoids isn't there anymore. So that's been hypothesized to be happening. But there's some evidence actually with invasive species that that's already happening with range changes with invasive species changing color. But that's still kind of an active question of how far that goes. So porphyrins that used in black lights, yes, that's actually an age signal in it's thought to be potentially an age signal in owls to reduce aggression. But I'm not, that's what it's thought to be, but I have not read a great study on that. So, but that's what I've heard hypothesized. Let's see, is iridescence seem to be used to distract predators? Have studies of colors and butterflies inform the birds, or vice versa? So iridescence, I do not know of any animals that use iridescence to distract predators, but it's a wide world out there, and I wouldn't rule it out. But I've never heard of it. What is interesting about different animals, like studies of one animal informing another animal, is what we found. Different scientists have found different pigments being found in different groups, and then re-evolution of some like visual pigments or pigments in feathers, and then finding them in other places as well. So I'm not sure of any, but that doesn't mean that they haven't informed studies of butterflies. Speculum color. It is, I know in some ducks it's used in sexual selection, but I don't know anything else. There's still a lot of room for studying, but in some species of ducks, when they display, the males will actually like put their beak through the speculum and kind of show it off. So it's thought to be kind of part of their their signaling, both the kind of the dance component and then the plumage component. So with sparrows and some finches, is there a lower level of honesty because they're so closely colored? Do they tend to use vocalizations more, more than color? So a lot of sparrows do use song, especially like our grassland sparrows. They use a lot more song than color, and that a lot of times, but it's hard to say because some of our really high vocalization birds are really brightly colored too. So some of them do it all, and some of them just do one. And I haven't heard a really good explanation of why some have it all and some of them just do one. One of the hypotheses why some males are really gaudy or have a lot of traits is that versus other males don't, is that these are kind of a legacy of previous signals that females no longer pay attention to or were no longer honest, so they kind of got decoupled from whatever they were originally signaling. So this is one thought with sage grouse, why they have so many different things going on, but they're only actually selecting on a couple of traits, even though they have a bunch of other ones. So that is one potential thing, is that you sometimes carry on evolutionary baggage, but there are birds that listen to song and select on coloration, do all of it. So I can't say for sure why finches are one thing and like warblers are another, because some of our finches really do signal a lot using color, like in American goldfinches, both the black cap and the yellow is sexually selected, and they sing, versus other finches are more vocal only. So I'm not sure, but there's a lot of lots of different combinations that are available in the amongst birds, and makes it interesting to watch them and see what they're using to talk to communicate with one another. Okay, if folks don't have any, or if anyone has any other questions, feel free to email me, or if you have any comments, we'll be sending out a survey to everyone who came. The recording will be going out, and I hope to see everyone in kind of our more traditional talks at about native plants next month. So see you all again soon. Thanks.